"You will never really belong at this table, Dana." My mother-in-law said that 4 weeks before her 40th anniversary gala, the week she handed out a printed seating chart with every name on it but mine, 6 years after I quietly kept her family from losing a $340,000 lake house to the bank, and what I did next, they never saw coming. Before I continue, subscribe if you want to hear how this ends. I spent my days deciding who got to keep their buildings. At 34, I was a senior vice president at Kestrel Point Capital, the kind of title that came with a glass-walled office on the 11th floor, a river view, and a calendar that started at 7 a.m. and rarely apologized for it. My job was simple to explain and merciless to do. I approved the loans, the leases, and the extensions that kept small businesses breathing and old estates from disappearing into foreclosure auctions nobody wanted to attend. Bankers called me before they called their own spouses some weeks. I kept a second, plainer coat on the back of my office door for site visits because the wool one I wore to meetings wasn't built for walking through half-condemned buildings with contractors. I liked the woman who lived in that office. She never flinched, and she never explained herself twice. At home, in the Calloway family, I was something else entirely. I married Grant 7 years earlier in a courthouse with 2 witnesses and a bouquet from a gas station. And I never took his name. Not to make a point, just because Dana Reyes already meant something before I ever sat down at a Calloway dinner table. The Calloways carried an old name that still opened doors in this town, even though the money behind it had thinned out long before I arrived. My mother-in-law, Diane, kept those doors open through sheer will, a closet full of good coats, and a calendar built entirely around galas. I learned fast in her house exactly what I was allowed to be. Useful. Always. Family. Almost never. The pattern started with the biggest thing first, which is its own kind of trap, because once you've given someone a house, every smaller thing after it feels too small to mention out loud. In October, 6 years ago, the 9th, a date I still know without checking anything, Robert called Grant at 11:20 p.m., his voice thin in a way I'd never once heard from him, to say the bank was 14 days from foreclosing on the lake house his own father had built in 1961. Grant wanted to fix it and had nothing on hand to fix it with. I had $92,000 sitting in a signing bonus I'd been quietly saving toward a down payment of my own, and something more useful than the money besides a desk at a firm that restructured debt for a living. I spent 3 weeks rebuilding that loan after my real job ended each night and put my own savings behind it as a personal guarantee so the bank would move before the deadline instead of after it. Robert kept the house. Diane told her book club that a distant cousin in banking had looked into things for the family. I sat 2 feet from her on her own sofa while she said it, a glass of unsweet tea sweating a ring onto the coaster in front of me, and I did not correct her. I told myself that was generosity. It took me 6 more years to call it what it actually was. I kept showing up anyway, and the smaller things kept coming. The following Thanksgiving, the restaurant declined the family's card in front of 12 people, and I paid the $1,860 deposit from my phone under the tablecloth so no one would have to say anything out loud. Diane thanked the restaurant manager for his patience. She did not thank me. 2 years after that, when Whitney got married, I wired $14,000 toward a venue balance nobody in the family could cover. 3 days before the ceremony, after Diane spent a full week telling anyone who'd listen how stretched they were that year. My name never made it into the toast. There were other things, too, smaller and easier to wave off. A shop insurance premium covered twice when Robert's business had a bad quarter. A set of tires for Whitney's car the winter she said she couldn't swing it. None of it made headlines. Every holiday after the lake house, I stood at the sink with my sleeves pushed up while the rest of the family moved into the living room, because somewhere along the way I decided that dish towels were a kind of application for belonging that nobody had actually asked me to fill out. The trigger arrived on a Sunday in March, 4 weeks before Robert and Diane's 40th anniversary gala, over a pot roast that had gone cold twice, while we waited on Whitney's kids to finish a video call in the other room. Diane had printed the seating chart, real cardstock, cream with gold script, laid out like a wedding program, and she went around the table showing each person their table number, the way a teacher hands back graded exams. Rain moved sideways against the dining room windows the whole time, and the overhead light hummed the way it always did in that house, too bright for the mood and too dim for the food. When she reached me, she used the specific smile she kept for hotel concierges and delivery drivers. "Dana, honey, we thought, since you're so good with details, you might help coordinate check-in that night instead of sitting. The room really only fits family, and we're already so tight on numbers." Whitney's husband was filming a slow pan across the table for his cooking account and caught 11 seconds of it without meaning to, the camera drifting past my face at the exact moment the sentence landed. Grandma Eleanor's fork stopped halfway to her mouth and stayed there. Robert studied the tablecloth like it owed him an explanation. I looked at the cardstock, at the empty space where a table number should have been printed beside my name, and I said, "Of course, happy to help." My voice did not move. Nothing in my face moved. Somewhere behind my ribs, something that had been fraying quietly for 6 years finished tearing. Clean. The way good paper tears once you finally pull it in the direction it was always meant to go. That night, I did not cry, because crying had never been the mechanism I ran on. I drove home in rain that hadn't let up since dinner, hung my coat on the hook by the door the way I always did, and poured 2 fingers of the bourbon Grant kept for occasions that never seemed to arrive. I sat at the kitchen table under the one light I ever actually used and opened my laptop. I pulled the Aldermere estate file first. Kestrel Point owned the property. A restored 1920s manor we'd spent 2 years and $11 million bringing back from a leaking, condemned relic into the kind of venue that books 18 months out. And I had personally authorized the account behind Diane's gala 11 weeks earlier, a courtesy hold on the adjoining conservatory for her overflow guests, without ever mentioning to a single person in that family that it ran through my desk. 130 guests, a room contracted for 90. The gap only existed because I had made it exist, quietly, the way I'd made most things in that family's life possible for 6 years, without anyone thinking to ask how. Then, because some part of me needed to understand exactly how long this had been the shape of things, I went looking for the old refinance file from the lake house, the one I'd built at midnight after my real job ended, 6 Octobers back. I found the disclosure page every guarantor's family member has to sign when their name touches a loan like that. Diane's signature was on it, dated October 31st, 3 weeks after the call that started everything. Not Robert's alone. Hers too. She had known, in ink, for 6 years, exactly whose money and whose signature had kept that house standing, and she let her book club believe in a cousin in banking anyway. I sat at that table until 1:47 in the morning, doing math I didn't need a calculator for. It came to just over $108,000 in 3 line items alone, and that wasn't counting everything smaller in between. Diane's entire anniversary gala, the one with no table number for me on it, was budgeted at $38,000. By the time I closed the laptop, I knew exactly what I was going to do, and it required nothing dramatic. No lawyer, no confrontation, not one raised word to a single person in that family before I was ready. It required 1 phone call from my own office during business hours on an ordinary Tuesday. Grandma Eleanor showed up 2 mornings later without calling first, the way she'd done for my entire marriage, and stood on my porch in the cold holding a manila folder against her chest like the wind might take it from her. She was 81, had buried a husband, and had outlived at least 2 of Diane's excuses for everything. I made tea neither of us drank, the steam fogging the cold kitchen window while it sat untouched between us. She set the folder on the table, and I recognized her handwriting on the tab, faded ballpoint pressed hard enough to dent the paper salt. the habit of a woman who learned young to write things down because no one believed her otherwise. Inside were photocopies of the same refinance disclosure I'd found at 1 a.m., plus something I didn't have, a ledger kept in her own hand since 1994, tracking every dollar that had quietly moved through that family and exactly who it had actually come from. She told me she'd started it the year she married into the Callaways, back when Robert's mother had done to her nearly the same thing Diane had just done to me. A folding chair at the far end of a room that mattered, a seat that kept disappearing whenever a chart got printed. Some things, she said, don't skip a generation so much as get folded up and handed down like good silver, waiting for someone to use them again. Then she looked at me over her glasses, steady in a way that made the whole kitchen feel quieter, and asked the only question that mattered. You want it quiet, she said, or you want it true? Have you ever paid a family's debts and still ended up with the seat closest to the coat check? Tell me in the comments. I want to know how many of us are doing this same math in our own kitchens at 1 a.m. Drop the word rise in the comments. I read every single one. That decision I'd made at my kitchen table became real on a Tuesday from my desk, between a 9 a.m. call about a shopping center refinance and a 10:15 about a hotel 3 payments from default. I pulled up the Aldermere file and looked at the courtesy extension still sitting unconfirmed in my own queue, past its 60-day window, with no deposit ever received on the additional 40 seats. Under any other circumstances, I would have approved it anyway, the way I'd quietly approved things for that family for 6 years running. Instead, I let the system do exactly what it was built to do when nobody intervened on a family's behalf. I typed 4 words into the note field, hold released, capacity reverts, and sent it to my coordinator, Marcus, at 9:52 a.m. The whole thing took 4 minutes. It was the smallest, most legal thing I had ever done in that office, and it turned out to be the loudest. Grant pushed back hard enough after that Sunday dinner that Diane relented on one point. Grudgingly, I would sit, not work, check in. She put me at table 11 near the kitchen doors, a folding chair added to the end of it at the last minute, 40 feet from the family and closer to the cake table than to anyone who shared my last name by marriage. I brought one folder with me that night anyway, thin, tucked inside my clutch, copies of a signature page dated 6 years back. I never had to open it. The gala filled the garden room at Aldermere with white orchids, a string quartet, and 130 guests in black tie. The whole room reading like a photograph nobody had gotten around to coloring in yet. Diane had booked the space through a friend on the Historical Preservation Board, believing she'd gotten a favor rate, never once asking who actually signed off on rates like that. She did not know I had approved her account. She did not know I had also, 3 days earlier, let the conservatory hold laps. She gave her toast at 8:40, champagne lifted, telling a room of 130 people about 40 years of family, about showing up for each other no matter the cost, about a lake house that had weathered every storm because we never once let each other fall. She looked at Robert when she said it. She did not look at me. I let her finish every word. I did not touch my glass. While the room was still applauding, the event coordinator, Marcus, doing his job exactly the way I'd trained him to, stepped up with a clipboard and did what any good coordinator does before a room has to shift on short notice. He thanked the hosts for their patience with the evening's seating adjustment and thanked, by name, Kestrel Point Capital and Senior Vice President Dana Reyes for making the garden room possible on such short notice these past few months. 130 faces turned to find someone named Dana Reyes. Whitney's mouth opened and stayed that way. 3 seats from Diane, a state senator's wife, said, "Wait, is that you?" loud enough to carry to the back wall. I stood, because 130 people were already looking, and staying seated through it would have been its own kind of lie. I did not raise my voice. I have never once needed to raise my voice to be heard clearly in a room. "I'm glad the room worked out," I said. I've spent 6 years making sure this family kept a roof, a house, and now a room, and I never needed anyone to know it was me. I only ever needed a chair when I showed up. Table 11 works fine tonight." Then I sat back down, folded my hands on the tablecloth, and let the silence finish the rest of the sentence for me. Diane's face did not crumble. That was never going to happen in front of a state senator's wife. It emptied instead, the way a house empties when the last box goes out the door, the shape of it still standing there, nothing left inside. For 1 second, no longer, something moved behind her eyes that looked almost like a 26-year-old bride who'd married into a name bigger than she was and sworn she'd never be looked past again. Then it was gone, and she reached for her water glass instead of answering anyone. Robert looked down at his own hands like he'd never seen them before. Grant found mine under the table and held on, and I let him, because some things you can carry in one hand even while you're finishing what you started with the other. The fallout didn't arrive as one dramatic night. It came the way real consequences usually do: slow, scattered, mostly quiet. Whitney texted me 2 days later, 3 words only: "I didn't know." I believed her mostly and decided to let that be enough for now. Robert called on a Thursday and talked for 6 minutes about gutters and weather before he said, low, that he should have said something about that October 6 years ago. I told him it wasn't too late to start saying it now. Grant went quiet for the better part of a week. The particular quiet of a man realizing his own silence had been its own kind of agreement. And then he started showing up differently, asking real questions at Sunday dinner instead of letting them slide past him into the gravy. Diane called once, 4 days after the gala, and I picked up. She spent 90 seconds on how Marcus shouldn't have said anything, on optics, on what the senator's wife would think of a coordinator discussing money in front of a room. I asked her once, evenly, if she remembered signing the disclosure page on October 31st, 6 years ago. The line went quiet enough that I could hear her kitchen clock ticking behind her. Then she said she had another call coming in, and she hung up before I said anything else. Word moved through that town the way it always does in a place with one good country club and one long memory. Not through anything I said out loud again, because I never mentioned it publicly after that night, but through a coordinator who told a florist who told someone on the preservation board, and a board that had spent 2 quiet years grateful to Kestrel Point for saving Aldermere from the wrecking crews in the first place. Diane's name came off next year's gala committee by the 2nd week of April, with a polite note about refreshing the roster. Nobody called it a punishment. Everyone understood it was one anyway. 6 months out, I got the promotion to regional director that had been sitting just out of reach for 2 years, the kind that comes with a corner office and a view of the river instead of the parking structure. Grant and I started seeing a therapist on Wednesdays at 6 p.m., a small office with a gray couch and a noise machine that never quite covers the sound of the waiting room, and we're still going, because 7 years of silence doesn't undo itself over one gala and one phone call. I still see the Callaways. I go to Sunday dinner most weeks now, and I sit wherever I choose to sit, and nobody has printed a seating chart for family dinner since. Robert calls every few weeks about nothing in particular, which from him is its own kind of apology. Whitney and I are rebuilding something slower and steadier than what we had before. Diane and I haven't had the conversation that would actually close the distance between us, and I've stopped waiting for it to happen on her schedule instead of mine. She's smaller in that family now, not gone, not punished into silence, just no longer the only one holding the pen. Grandma Eleanor still calls me most Sunday mornings before church. Last month, she told me she was finally ready to retire her ledger, now that someone younger knew how to keep one. I left the door open about an inch, the way you leave a door when you haven't finished deciding, and most nights that feels like exactly the right amount of open. I didn't get the version where everyone cries and apologizes and the table magically gets bigger. I got something quieter than that and more durable, a seat I chose for myself at a table where nobody gets to decide I don't belong there but me. If this touched something real, share it with someone who needs to hear it today.